Well, basically, Solomon Islands is scrambling for a compromise here that everyone can live with, Johnson. So a bit of back history here. Taiwan's long met with its Pacific allies at the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting since at least 1992 and before, in fact. So this isn't in itself controversial. But what's happened recently is that Beijing successfully whittled down its pack of diplomatic allies. So there used to be 6 countries in the Pacific that recognised Taiwan. That number is now down to 3. So what China's essentially doing now is it's trying to press home its advantage. And what we saw over the last 2 years is essentially an attempt by China to try and force Pacific Island countries to exclude Taiwan entirely from the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting. We saw that last year in Tonga. We saw it to some degree the year before in Cook Islands. This is now a full court press. And of course, with Solomon Islands hosting this year, Beijing has a real opportunity because it's made enormous inroads in Solomon Islands over the last 6 years or so since Solomon Islands recognised Beijing. And it's been really pressing Jeremiah Manele to essentially say to Taiwan, no, you're not welcome. We're not going to issue visas to your officials. You can't come along. The problem for Mr. Manele, though, is while he's facing pressure on one flank from China, he's getting pressure as well on the opposite flank from those 3 remaining countries in the Pacific that still recognise Taiwan. So, for example, Palau has said that if Taiwan is excluded, it might boycott PIF entirely. So that would present Mr. Manele, with a really difficult set of choices. He either has to tell the PRC that it effectively has to back off, or he has to risk another iteration of the PIF split that we saw just a few years ago when a number of Micronesian nations effectively cut ties with the forum. So this is why he's landed, or is at least looking to press ahead with this potential solution where essentially he says to all comers, Beijing, Washington, DC, Taipei, countries across Europe, countries across the Middle East, sorry, we're just going to press pause on all of this. You're not welcome to come this year. Only PIF members are allowed. Now, he'll put a bit of a procedural veil over this. He'll say this is because a separate review of regional architecture and of the PIF mechanism for dialogue partners is still being completed. But the reality is that this is essentially a political solution that Mr. Manele is sort of groping his way towards, one that he hopes will allow him to, 1, keep the PRC on side, but 2, avoid a damaging public brawl over Taiwan's future that could potentially split the forum on his watch.
Now, you mentioned Palau there, but how have other nations responded to the idea of excluding countries that aren't PIF members?
Well, so far we haven't had any on-the-record direct response to this idea from Mr. Manele. I'm told that he put it a couple of days ago, or yesterday really, to the PIF Troika as part of the process of trying to work out what to do next. It's been informally circulated amongst other Pacific nations, but at this stage I understand it hasn't been formally put to any exterior nation. So I think what's going to be critical here is how does Taiwan respond, how does the US respond, and perhaps most importantly, how does China respond to this? Some PIF dialogue members are likely to be unhappy about this or disappointed with this. They really value that opportunity they get during the leaders' meeting to actually sit down and press the flesh with Pacific leaders. But it's also possible that countries like the US may in the end shrug their shoulders and say, look, this is not ideal, this is as a result of PRC pressure on Taiwan, but it's still better than the alternative, which is potentially a fissure running through the middle of the Pacific Islands Forum. So I think what happens next depends very much on how those major players who aren't PIF members respond to this proposal. It may be that Mr. Manele has threaded the needle here and he can keep the show on the road, but it's also possible that some countries may be quite unhappy. And of course, it's also going to be really critical to see what Taiwan says and does. In a sense, although this is a blow to a lot of countries, the blow is heaviest for Taiwan because unlike, for example, the US, unlike, France, unlike Japan, and certainly unlike China, it doesn't really have an opportunity to actually meet with a large number of Pacific Island nations in person outside of the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting. So if Taiwan responds angrily even to this compromise, then countries like Palau and Tuvalu may feel like they have to respond negatively as well. So the whole situation, honestly, Johnson, right now is really, really delicate. Mr. Manele may have found a way to thread the needle, but it's also possible that this still does turn into an almighty regional stoush.
Look, there's still about 5 weeks left until that PIF leaders meeting, so a lot can happen between now and then with Manele's proposal. Let's take a look now, because tensions over Taiwan have been growing for a while, with a recent planned stopover by Lai Ching-te to the US cancelled, reportedly after a request by Donald Trump. How will this issue be solved, and won't it still be a problem at next year's PIF, which is due to be held in Palau?
Yeah, it absolutely still will be a problem next year. In a sense, what Mr Manele here is doing, perhaps understandably, is kicking the can down the road. Eventually, Pacific Island leaders are going to have to grapple with this and either publicly stand by the communique from 1992 that allows this to happen, or come up with a new formulation that tries to ensure that every year this doesn't just emerge once again as a flashpoint or as a form of proxy war between Taiwan and the PRC. So at some point this is going to have to be resolved. The problem is China remains absolutely determined to press its case, and more perhaps than it was in the past. This means that it's going to continue to use what leverage it has over its allies and countries which recognise it to try and exclude Taiwan. So I think it's likely that perhaps next year the Pacific Islands Forum is going to have to take the opportunity to make a stand on this. It's going to be easier to do that in Palau than elsewhere, because Palau still retains very strong links with Taiwan. In other words, it's unimaginable that they wouldn't invite Taiwan along if Pacific dialogue partners are still going to be welcome. Perhaps this can be wrapped some way into this broader review of a new mechanism for dialogue partners. Perhaps Pacific Island nations can say, look, we're going to specifically carve out this space for Taiwan, for those remaining countries that still recognise it, so they can continue to meet. But it is a fraught and potentially explosive issue, and those broader tensions around China's ambitions for Taiwan, threats potentially of an invasion in the next few years, all of that will just make this more heady and potentially more toxic rather than less.
Stephen, thank you very much for joining us.
No problem, Johnson. Thanks.